Recording in progress.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is right at 4 o'clock, and we will call the Community Impact Grants Committee meeting to order. Madam Clerk, can you call the roll, please?
Branham,
Here.
Livingston,
Here.
Barron,
Here.
Mackey,
Here.
English.
Present.
We have a quorum.
Next item on the agenda is approval of the minutes from December 7th, 2022. It's on pages 2 through 5.
Second.
Moved and properly seconded. Is there any discussion or changes that need to be made? There being none, Madam Clerk, can you call for the vote?
Branham,
Yes.
Livingston, Barron,
Yes.
Mackey,
Yes.
English.
Yes.
Motion approved.
Thank you. Moving on to item 3 is the adoption of the agenda. May I have a motion? Any discussions or additions? Madam Clerk, can you call for the vote?
Branham,
Yes.
Livingston,
Yes.
Barron,
Yes.
Mackey,
Yes.
English.
Yes.
Motion approved.
Moving on to item 5. Moving on to item 4, election of the chair. We will now open the floor for nominations.
Nomination. Second.
Moved and properly seconded. Are there any other nominations? There being none, we close the nominations. Madam Clerk, can you call for the vote?
Branham,
Yes.
Livingston,
Yes.
Barron,
Yes.
Mackey,
Yes.
English.
Yes.
Motion approved.
Madam Chair, I will now turn it over to you.
You'd be delighted to do that too.
Yeah, I heard that excitement in her voice.
Passed it real fast now.
Thank you, Councilwoman English, and thank you to my colleagues for selecting me or giving your support to chair this committee. The next item on the agenda are items for discussion / action. 5A, which is committee goals. This item is really a discussion as a whole for this committee moving forward to make sure we all feel good about the goals and on the same page of the committee. Last year, when we started the committee, it came out of a motion that was made during the budget process for us to rename the Discretionary Grants Committee to the Community Impacts Grant Committee and add additional council members to that committee. And we had our meetings last year and really focused on the application process, the application that we put out for the additional $300,000 that council approved. And we spent most of our meetings reviewing those applications and awarding funds to those organizations. And so now, as we move into beginning our budget process for our next fiscal year, really looking at this committee to kind of determine how we want to move forward in the process of which we want to do that. Initially, the committee council members all agreed that this committee was set about to really create a true process for how we're going to distribute grants to our community partners and what that looks like, and really look at ways to tie initiatives and priorities that align with our strategic plan and that council all is agreeance upon how we want to move forward and the process that everyone can understand. So staff has put together a presentation for us that looks at historical funding of kind of what this council, but also previous council have done in the past when it looks at supporting community organizations. Also, looking at our funding, we know ARPA funds, the county has received a large amount, and council has agreed to set aside a portion of that to community partners and nonprofits as well. So looking at that funding and holistically seeing what we've historically done so that we can kind of look to what makes sense moving forward. So if there aren't any other questions around committee goals, I want to turn it over to staff to go through the historical funding presentation that's inside our packet. Right?
Thank
PCA
you.
Thomas?
Thank
Oh,
you.
sorry,
No,
Mr.
just
Brown?
gonna- I was
Okay.
gonna do that.
Okay.
Go right ahead.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Committee. I appreciate you having me here this afternoon. You all know I'm a spreadsheet geek, so I've sort of sliced and diced a lot of data to give you some idea of how the county in the past has funded some of its community partners and what the sources of those funds were and what those funds looked like going out into the community. If you'll turn to the second page of the, or the first page following the title sheet, titled Historical Funding Summary, this color-coded graph actually shows you the funds that have been put back into the community and where those funds came for over the last 5 years. In 2019, all of these funds came from the general fund, the blue being the general fund bar. In 2020, these also came from the general fund, but as you know, in 2021, we pulled back significantly because of the COVID impact. So they also were coming from the general fund at that point in time. At that point, it was about just over $2 million, down from a high of $2.7 million in 2019. In 2022, we had the luxury of having some of the ARPA funding that came into play for the county, and we were able to reallocate some of the funds that had come from the general fund to the ARPA funding as we realized significant pressures and responsibilities across the county. So in 2021, as you'll see, we put about $934,000 of what had been general fund into ARPA, with the remainder of that, just slightly over $1 million coming from the general fund. In 2022, we actually had an added layer of ARPA, if you will, there. We put $770,000 in general fund dollars out to the community for awards. ARPA was $1.113 million, and then another $985,000 that was originally set aside for potential shortfalls for millage agencies. In the historical funding summary, basically, this just shows you how much these totals come to over the 5 years. Looking out at the 5-year total, just under $12 million has been reallocated to the community through these sources. So if you average that over the 5-year period, we're right at $2 million a year on average into the community. Going to the next page, I wanted to talk a little bit about the sources of these funds, or the pots of money, if you will, for these funds. Historically here in Richland County, there has been what we call discretionary grant funds. The discretionary grant funds started out somewhere in the neighborhood of about $400,000. They were pulled back in 2021 to about $200,000, and for 2 pages there, you will see the yearly allocations by group from the discretionary grant funds. This was made up of the discretionary grant committee, which was a small group of council members that would review applications that were applied, that were submitted by community groups for allocation of funding. The most recently, we've done $200,000 a year for the last 2 years. We do have 1 year where it slipped below $200,000, and typically that will happen because some group may not claim all of their allocation. Any questions? Okay. The next sheet, which has the blue body to it is the Historical General Fund lump sum allocations. Lump sum allocations come to the council in the form of council motions during the budget process historically. These are not competitive. These are just discussions among council during the budget process. And as you can see, that has totaled $7.5 million over the 5 years, with the largest amount being $2.3 million in 2019, and then in 2023, $311,000. I will remind you, though, that in 2023, we had $200,000 in discretionary funds and an additional $300,000 in what was then named the Community Impact Grants. So you would need to add those two numbers onto it to come up with about $770,000 that was awarded to community partners in that fund. Questions on any of those? Moving on to the next page, which has the orange background. There's only 1 year of funding on this. It's the orange ones are the community impact grants. This was the $300,000 that was allocated by council in the budget process for additional funding to community members. We actually awarded $259,445.75 of the $300,000 by council appropriation. Questions? The next couple of pages actually allocate color-coded the organizations and the funding that they received. Some organizations, as you would see, have received multiple sources of funds, either the discretionary, which you will find with no colored backing, lump sum, which will have a blue backing. The orange is the community impact grants there, and then the green are ARPA allocations to these groups. And that makes up 2 pages. I'm sorry, actually 3 pages. And these come to a total of $14.5 million.
C.A. Thomas, just to confirm, the ARPA and green is only things that we have approved. This is not folks that have requested ARPA that are still waiting for approval. This is just only what has been approved.
That is correct. Everything that is here has been allocated and or spent. Of course, with 2023, we're not all the way through the year, so many of these appropriations have not been secured yet. Any questions?
Councilmember Weaver?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm here today just to put a plug in for 2 groups on this list. They're both from my district. I don't know if this is the appropriate time or not, but I just like to put it out there. I've met with, on page 11, I believe, Sexual Trauma of the Midlands. They were on the grant list before. They were not last year. They've now changed their names to Pathways to Healing, but it's about rape survivors, and I've got a letter of support from Sheriff Lott. In fact, the executive director, Rebecca Lorick, was with a news conference with the sheriff a couple weeks ago on TV about a rape survivor. So I would just hope the committee could find some money for them. Very good group. If we can't find money for rape survivors, I'm not sure who we can find money for. So hopefully the committee will see their way to that. And then the second group is on page 10. I've also met with them in my district on the Therapy Place. They work with all kinds of children with disabilities. They have been on the grant list in the past, $10,000 a year. They work with autistic children, children with disabilities. They actually have a waiting list from parents trying to get in there, people that are driving from several towns over. Space is so limited. So hopefully, again, the committee can see the way to helping the Therapy Place again.
Thank you, Councilmember Weaver.
Thank you.
And not sure if you were here for the beginning presentation where he talked about the goals of the committee, but the Community Impact Grant Committee is a newly formed committee so that council members can identify a unified process for all nonprofits to follow the same process. And so once this committee agrees, that process will be brought to council for full approval, and all nonprofits will submit applications through the same process. And so at that time, we can decide as a council.
Great, thank you. Thank
You're welcome. Councilmember Livingston?
Mr. Thomas, in the first page where you have the
it's highlighted in blue. Where you're showing, we can go over to fiscal year 23, there, the agencies that did receive money, but there's no money listed. You know, for example, senior resources, transitions. Did some of those places receive money in 23?
Those were ARPA dollars.
So all of excuse me, I apologize, were transferred to ARPA dollars.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Is that on a particular page, ACA Thomas?
No, they are listed on the combined pages where they're in green. Okay.
Helpful for me here to recognize those that were funded with ARPA dollars somehow.
I think on page 15 and page 16. If you look on the left-hand side of the page, well, it's on literally the left side, not at the bottom, but
I'll give you for instance, a senior resources, which is on, what page is that? Can we go one more page, please,
15.
Madam Clerk?
there you go.
There we go. So if you look at senior resources, you noticed you have you have a blue lines there. Those were years they were funded by general fund. And then the last 2 years were actually ARPA funds. They're in the green. Thank you.
Anything else, Councilmember Livingston? Okay. Councilwoman Barron?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and if I need to hold this question for later, I'm fine with it. But as we look at the information that's being presented to us, the first question that comes to my mind is that we've been very blessed over the last several years to have ARPA funds and federal dollars that allowed us to do things a little bit differently in our general fund budget. Thus we chose a different way to award lump sums. But as we now get to the end of receiving funds, I'm concerned, and maybe, I am concerned. I'm concerned how we will continue to move forward with funding some of these organizations. I know that this is probably a deeper conversation that we will probably have, but it almost looks like now that the ARPA funds are gone, does that mean that we no longer fund these organizations at the level that we've been funding them? And we've transitioned tremendously over the last couple of years in funding nonprofits, but that's a concern of mine. I don't know if that's a question or a statement, but I'd like for us to kind of work through that at some point.
Councilwoman Barron, I think, you're spot on. And the reason that we're starting and having these meetings now is because we do need to think about it ahead of time. We start budget meetings, in April, and, we'll go through different readings. And so the purpose of this committee is to start thinking about that now and planning ahead, because you're right, we have the ARPA dollars, and we know right now several organizations have submitted for funding, and they'll get going into next year. Whenever, the committee approves, the coronavirus committee approves, then there'll be other organizations that'll add to this list that'll have a separate amount of money. But the point of the committee meeting now is to determine what that looks like, what is the process, how are we going to plan for it in this upcoming budget cycle and years moving forward, also realizing that we have many other obligations that we've looked at through our strategic plan. And so you're completely right, and that is where I believe those conversations are going to happen and should happen, is in this committee, so we can all be on the same page and come out with a recommendation for the full body.
So I'd like to follow up with that, and that is, it's probably a little late, but, as organizations applied for different funding from us, have we sent out, or, whatever the process is when when organizations want to be considered for lump sum, has that process already started?
So, Sorry. So I guess I would like to say, as far as, consideration for lump sum, we've seen that in the past to where organizations have been reaching out to council members. So I don't think there's been a process for lump sum. Folks just know they reach out to council members and council members then make a motion for that to happen. Now, there has been a process that we followed for discretionary grant, for hospitality, for accommodations, but for lump sum, it's just kind of been, whenever they come in, and we've even received some when we've already started with the budget. And so I don't think that there is a quote-unquote process for that lump sum, but there is for the others. I do know that staff has, started receiving requests, and that's something at this point, this committee has to decide how we're going to respond and let those folks know what is our process moving forward.
I don't want to get bogged down here, but I just, I want us to be able to really think about this and give a lot of thought to it. And that is, we talked about, I think, last budget cycle about everybody having an application on file and make an application. And even during the lump sum process, there was conversation about, well, we just have a request, or, a request was only made by a council member, as you shared. And so, again, as we move forward, I just want to stress even more so the importance of, that council members sure can make recommendation, but I think that there still needs to be a uniform way of how we do business. And Mr. Brown, I know what you're going to say already. That's why we need this grants office. So let's get it started. And so all of that, right? Yeah, a little animation. But so let's get it started with the whole grants office. And I think that's our challenge right there. That's really our challenge. If we had a grants office, a lot of this conversation that we have and putting the responsibility back on council members would not be so difficult. But I digress, because I could talk all day about this stuff. Excuse me, I'm done.
I appreciate your comments, Councilwoman Barron, and I appreciate your interest, because I think everything you said is right. And we do need a process. We don't have the grants office right now, but I've heard council members say in previous meetings that, the application that we've been using isn't right, or we need to change it. And I think this is our opportunity and time now to make those changes and to give our feedback and start the process the right way. And so ultimately, that's what I hope we can walk away with, is what is that process that we all as council members feel good about, that then staff can communicate to the public so they all understand what that process is, and then we all agree on what that actual dollar amount is. Councilwoman Livingston?
Yes, I want to just make sure that we don't punish those agencies for this current year because we switched their funds to ARPA funds. And for some, there seems to be, since we don't have ARPA funds anymore, let's just get rid of them. Well, that wasn't their choice to take ARPA funds. So there was a tendency for some folks to say, well, we just get rid of those who we gave ARPA funds to, and I think that's a big mistake. Also, too, there are going to be a couple of agencies we're going to probably have to figure out a way to separate out and put on an annual appropriation and so forth because of their impact on the county. And how they evolve in terms of where they are now. To give a good example, we used to have a council on aging in Rich County one time. We don't have that anymore. Senior Resources assume that responsibility, and that's why the county stopped shifting the funds to them. So if you choose to say, okay, we're not going to fund them anymore, or they have to compete every year, then that's going to be one example of a major agency in your county that's just not going to be able to function. Is going to be dramatic. So there may be a few agencies we may need to just take out and say these are extremely essential to Richland County and what they do because of the funds they leverage and the importance in the county, and single those out and then work with the others somehow.
Thank you. Councilwoman Newland.
Thank you. And just thank you to the committee, because this is a conversation that we need to have, and it's helpful to have it before budgeting time. And thank you to the staff for all of the work that they're going to do. A lot of the points that I was interested in have been made, so I'll just say one really briefly. I think Ms. Barron mentioned this, but I would love to see there be criteria as we look at our lump sum appropriations, where I've seen cases where, you know, there may be an organization that, you know, I'm familiar with their record keeping and their track record, who gets this much money, whereas we're expending lots more funds and we're not getting an equal amount of transparency from what those organizations. And I think it just would be helpful for us, even with lump sum, to formalize that a little. So that would be one of my recommendations that we look at as we move forward with this process. And also to look at, one of the decisions that we'll have to make as part of this committee is, you know, as we look at, are there organizations we want to pull out and have them be in the general fund? I think that makes sense, but also have us look at, are there thresholds that we want to reach where, you know, through this process, we only contribute up to X amount for nonprofits, or up to X percent of their budget for some of these groups. That's some of the information that I would like to see us discuss as we move forward as a body.
Councilwoman Livingston?
I have a question. When we talk about community impact grants, are we talking about lump sum and discretionary? Are we going to keep the $100 committee, $300,000 to use for the committee? Are we talking just grouping those together? Because they were so different.
Yes, sir. So when the motion was made and we agreed as a whole, there is no longer a discretionary grant committee. So we have a community impact grant committee that holistically needs to look at how we are giving out grants and funding and working with community partners. And so at this point, we have not, as a committee, allocated a dollar amount moving forward. We allocated $300,000 last year, but that is a new decision that we need to make this year as we go into the next budget cycle. What is the allocated amount that we want to have to give out for grants? What is that process going to be like? And what is the criteria that we are going to set? So ultimately, we truly have a blank pad at this time to write the process moving forward that we talked about in creating transparency, and so that everyone feels they're on the same page, and so when the time comes and we're voting and supporting, we all know what we're voting for. Does that help clear it up a little bit?
So when we look at the total dollar amount that we spent on grants last year for discretionary and lump sum, including the lump sum amount that was also from the ARPA funds, what's that total amount? Do we have that total amount? So we'll know what we spent.
Sorry, if you look at the third page, it was $2.868 million. It's the chart. If you'll go back a couple, Madam Clerk, keep going. Right there. The next to the last column is your 2023 column. $2.868 million.
All right, ACA Thomas, you can proceed.
Thank
Wait,
you.
I'm sorry, 1 minute. Let me welcome our Chair of County Council, Oja Walker. Thank you so much for joining us. As well as we had of Councilmember Shakise Newton join, and Councilmember Don Weaver. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. The last two pages that you have in the package there that I've put together is historical funding by organization amount. It does not indicate, like the color-coded sheet does, it does not indicate the source of the funds, but rather what the funding level has been to these groups for the last 5 years on an annual basis and on a total. And those are the last two pages in the presentation.
Thank you.
Just for clarification, on that same page that you just first referenced me to, now you also have funding, included in that funding is $850,000 for millage agencies, which would not be considered lump sum or discretionary.
Yes, sir, so that would bring
So we can back that out and say,
$2.018 million.
okay, yeah, that's a lot less, thank you.
All right.
So my
Hearing no
question
other
was- so
questions?
my point I was getting to was, so they'll take that 2 point whatever, we came to, if you were to fund everything you did for, discretionary and lump sum for this past year.
Yes, sir.
And I do want to point out, I think that is a fact, yes, Mr. Livingston, about the total, but I think we all probably know throughout this, there were, organizations that maybe got missed or weren't included. And so I don't want it to automatically look like, okay, everybody from last year automatically is what we're looking at. I think we holistically are looking at the process to make sure that we are helping the right community partners that we all agree
I
about.
think that's most important to you.
Yeah. Okay, any other questions for ACA Thomas? Councilman Barron?
And I might be back to the same thing. I'm thinking this is a forward conversation indeed. But as it is a forward conversation, and maybe I'm just trying to visualize what this upcoming budget cycle is gonna look like. Is it our goal to have this structure in place prior to us starting to dig through our budget? Is that our goal? Or is it our goal to create the process, and as we create the process, knowing that this year's budget cycle may be a little different, and then start to implement and roll out leading up to 2024?
So, Councilman Barron, I'm just gonna share, my thoughts, but I think ultimately it's up for, committee's consideration. But the next item on the agenda is kind of next steps and timeline and talking about that, because you're right, we have a schedule already that's set for when we're gonna start discussing budget. And I think based on, where we are and what needs to be done, I would recommend that we more so focus on what is the dollar amount that we want to commit to and figuring that out, so at least we can go ahead and plan for that in the budget and know when we start talking about budget conversation or we get the budget book that there's at least a dollar amount set aside, and we all agree on that, and then go into the process. And we can kind of set a timeline for ourselves that said, okay, here's when we want to have the process done, and communicate that to nonprofits, but at least we know here's the amount we all feel comfortable about, and we're not, we're going to stay within this amount when we look at giving out dollars. Does that work? Okay, so going into next steps and timeline, ACA Thomas, before you sit down, please, just one more thing. I did want to, Councilman Barron brought up a good point that I want to highlight on. Could you kind of remind us again, what are those dates, just high-level dates for the budget? When is it expected to kind of start, or when is first reading expected?
We expect to actually transmit the budget book, the recommended budget book to you all April the 10th, I believe it is. First reading will become the first meeting in May, which I'm sorry I don't remember that date exactly, with third reading actually coming in the first meeting in June, which I believe is June the 6th. And the second reading and public hearing will fall in beyond that.
Okay. So ideally, it would be good if full council could have agreed upon dollar amount before May 1st, or are you thinking in April?
Ideally, the earlier we know the numbers, the easier it is for us to propose a balanced budget. That has been the difficulty in the past, is as motions come to the council during session, we're not proposing a balanced budget to you in its, from the time we give you the recommended budget book. So really, if we could ideally a funded number by the end of March, or sometime in the late March timeframe would be good, so that it could be included, so that we know what it's going to take to actually balance our budget.
Thank you. Okay, so based off of ACA Thomas' timeline moving forward with budget, it would look as if the committee, we could have a few more meetings to think about our next steps as it relates to a dollar amount, and then moving forward, getting approval to council. I have taken some notes. I think staff has some notes too of questions or thoughts that were brought up today, or requests for additional information. But I would like for all council members to at least think about, a dollar amount they may have in mind, or, a percentage of something, or some form or number that they feel comfortable with. So when we come together for our next meeting, we could talk about that. And if you could provide that even ahead of the next scheduled meeting, we can work with staff to maybe pull another colorful graph for us, and we can talk about what that'll look like and impacts. Okay. All right, any other thoughts, questions regarding process and next steps? All right, item 6, adjournment.
Second.
Have a motion and a second, Madam Clerk?
Brenham,
Yes.
Livingston,
Yes.
Barron,
Yes.
Mackey,
Yes,
English.
Yes.
Motion approved.
thank you.